Well, everyone can close their books for a couple minutes, a few minutes. And I have a question for you all. Has anyone here yet seen the new documentary on David Chase and the making of The Sopranos? Yeah? Okay, one? Okay. I recommend it for mature audiences.
One in the back.
We got another one? Great. And twice. Okay, so that's your endorsement right there. And so in the beginning, so a couple of you remember this, not everyone. In the beginning of the documentary, they show a number of actors trying out for the main role, the Tony Soprano role, each acting out a short monologue of Tony while he's in therapy. And he says, let me tell you something. Nowadays, everybody's got to go to shrinks and counselors and go on Sally, Jesse, Raphael and talk about their problems. Whatever happened to Gary Cooper, the strong, silent type? That was an American. He wasn't in touch with his feelings. He just did what he had to do. So what they didn't know, once they got Gary Cooper in touch with his feelings, that they wouldn't be able to shut him up. And then it's dysfunction this and dysfunction that. There's a couple more choice words that I won't share. Tony does not like to talk about his feelings. That much is clear. What he really struggles with as the show progresses is something that many of us struggle with, and that's vulnerability, particularly emotional vulnerability. And it makes sense. Vulnerability is uncomfortable. It's brutally honest. It's often unpleasant. It requires us to be seen, to put ourselves out there, to share uncertainties or weaknesses or challenges, problems, the deeper parts of ourselves. And what is really scary is that we don't know how whoever we are vulnerable with will react. On the other side of vulnerability, however, just beyond the journey to summon up the courage and share of ourselves is connection. Vulnerability leads to connection. This is one of the main ideas of popular researcher, social worker, storyteller, and author Brené Brown. It is also one of the main ideas of the Jewish holiday that we are currently in the middle of, Sukkot. But first, Brené Brown. She came on the scene. She's written a number of books. You may have seen them. She came on the scene initially in 2010 with a viral TED Talk called The Power of Vulnerability. Over 22 million views on YouTube. 22 million people sitting through a 20-minute speech about vulnerability. Don't worry, this is not 20 minutes, this one here. In it, she describes vulnerability as a source of strength and courage, not as a weakness. She suggests that the biggest barrier to being vulnerable is shame. The shame that we're not good enough or that we don't belong, often silent and secret. That is what keeps us from deeply sharing and ultimately connecting with others. Which ends up being her point about vulnerability. It is uncomfortable, but it does lead to deeper relationships and a greater sense of belonging. Vulnerability leads to connection. And now Sukkot. Does anyone have any idea why we build Sukkot on this holiday? Any takers? Anyone know? Yeah, thank you, David. It reminds us of how vulnerable we are. In the Torah, we're instructed to build these Sukkot, to recognize this festival. You might be surprised to know that the Israelites themselves don't spend a night in a sukkah as it's described in the Torah itself. They spend lots of time in tents, but not a sukkah as we are instructed to build it. So two rabbis a couple of millennia ago were trying to figure this out. Why are we instructed to build these Sukkot if the Israelites in the Torah didn't exactly build them this way that we know of? And so one responds how David responded. The Torah might not explicitly say it, but nonetheless, we build these Sukkot because that's what they lived in, and we are remembering the uncertain and vulnerable experiences of the Israelites. The other says that we build Sukkot because they're actually supposed to represent when God was protecting the Israelites in the desert as a pillar of cloud. It's not supposed to recall the vulnerable times. It's supposed to recall the times of close connection with God. The Talmud does not give us a straight answer whether we build a sukkah for the Israelites' vulnerability or the Israelites' connection with God. So a common Jewish answer would be both, which is correct. The sukkah represents vulnerability as this impermanent, weak structure that braves the wind and the rain, and it also represents connection to God as we peek to the sky through the roof, shake our lulav in all directions, and trust that even while we're exposed to the elements, God is our protector. Which is a good answer, but if Brene Brown were in the Talmud, she might suggest that it's the Israelites' vulnerability that leads to that sense of connection. And ours too. Less than a week ago, the Jewish calendar guided us through a day of significant vulnerability. What did we do wrong in the past year? Who do I apologize to? Ki ein banu ma'asim, we have no good deeds. Al chet shechatanu lefanecha, we have sinned before you. Ashamnu, bagadnu, gazalnu. Yom Kippur gives us language and structure to be at our most vulnerable. That vulnerability is uncomfortable and can certainly evoke shame or guilt, but a short 5 days after that, we build vulnerable structures in which we rejoice. Perhaps we build a sukkah because we are a sukkah. On Yom Kippur, we strip ourselves down to our barest human selves, our mistakes, our hopes, our powerlessness, and on Sukkot, we build ourselves back up, not as a palace, but as a structure that represents our humanity, built with love, at its best when people gather, exposed to the elements, vulnerable, and ultimately a source of connection and celebration. Further, while we access the less pleasant on Yom Kippur, the promise of Sukkot is the promise that we are not only our mistakes and our incompleteness. By embracing vulnerability, we aren't only able to access the hard stuff, we're able to access love and pride and joy. Indeed, we are commanded to rejoice on Sukkot not once, but twice in the Torah, the only holiday where we receive that instruction 2 times. So to get back to Tony Soprano, I want to be very clear, he is no role model. But the show was so successful because viewers could still relate to him. We can all relate to that resistance to opening up and being vulnerable out of fear or avoidance or anything else. As ancient wisdom and modern research guide us, however, I hope that we can also relate to the fruits of that labor. That's connection. The connection when you learn that someone else shares your struggle or doesn't, but still cares for you. The connection when we realize we are all to some extent exposed to the elements, vulnerable in our Sukkot, and because of that, we are connected to one another, to tradition, to God, in many more ways than we know, and are fully able to samachta b'chagecha, to rejoice in this holiday. So I hope everyone has a joyous and vulnerable and connected festival of Sukkot. And after services, we'll have an opportunity to wave lulav and etrog in the sukkah. So Shabbat Shalom and happy Sukkot.